This is part 7 of a cognitive meta-theory that integrates TESOL and Christianity. In this final section, we will be focusing upon several core Christian doctrines. Before we begin, let's look at the Christian doctrines that we have discussed so far. We begin by looking at how the mind forms a concept of God, and we suggested that a Christian concept of a universal God, corresponding to God the Father, emerges as a universal theory in teacher thought, applies to personal identity and mercy thought. We then noticed that following Piaget's stages of cognitive development, the human mind naturally develops mercy thought first and will interpret all of existence in terms of mercy thought, using mercy mental networks as the initial reference. That leads to the sin nature, where you have the person taking shortcuts because you have a fragmented mind composed of mercy mental networks that are not properly integrated internally. However, it is possible to take shortcuts to express these internally fragmented mental networks taking advantage of the external structure of the body and the physical world. We also notice that the natural tendency is for the mind to interpret God from a mercy perspective, relating this to Piaget's concrete operational stage. Again, looking at the cognitive science of religion, remember that it does research observing the mercy aspect of religion. It looks at folk religion, but it does not know how to interpret theology, a Christian concept of God, or personal transformation. If one wants to understand these elements, the elements that go beyond the initial mental foundation of mercy mental networks, then one needs to go beyond the software of the mind, which starts with mercy mental networks, is based in that foundation, and look at the hardware of the mind, how it is constructed, how it can be programmed. We looked at God the Father, we looked at the sin nature, we also looked at the Holy Spirit, which is a concept of universality and mercy thought, and we suggested that a concept of divine spirit can emerge in one of two ways. Either the external environment can provide the glue, can tie together the internal mercy experiences that represent people and other situations, leading to a spirit of the world. Or it is possible to form a general understanding that applies to personal identity. That's the concept of God the Father. That then leads internally to an interconnected system of Platonic forms that ties everything together in mercy thought. This is also a concept of divine spirit, but it is a Holy Spirit of truth that is the third person of the Trinity. We will now turn our attention to the second person of the Trinity, which is God the Son. And here we have the general topic of incarnation. If one looks at Christian thinking about incarnation, it generally has followed one of two streams. First of all, there is what one could call the Greek thought, which, as we already know, talks about Platonic forms. Plato, of course, was Greek, views God in terms of universal perfection. So you have God as related to the form of the good, looking at the ultimate goodness. The problem with this interpretation of incarnation is that it ends up with a concept of God that is static and unchangeable. Obviously, if God is perfect and if God is an object, then if God moves or changes in any way, then the feeling is that he would move away from his state of perfection. That's what happens when one uses only perceiver facts to form a general theory, and then that results in a Platonic form, and one equates that Platonic form with God. Historically, that's been the problem with looking at God from a static truth perspective, the Greek perspective. The other way is to interpret incarnation from a left hemisphere, from a server, from an action perspective. And this is the Jewish perspective, where you have the Jews, and also in the Old Testament, you have God working through history. So you have the people of Israel doing actions, performing actions, going through a server sequence of physical movement, of physical life, a sequence that now is extended for several millennia. And then these actions are connected with the overall understanding of God. So you have actions and words related. And this is a very strong Jewish concept, because historically the Jewish male was supposed to have some sort of vocation. So he learned server actions, a set of server skills, and he was also supposed to know about the Torah. So he knew the words. And this connection between actions and words is very strong in the Jewish thought. Problem with that by itself is that it tends to limit God to Jewish life. So in Jewish thinking, God is described as a universal being, as omnipotent and omniscient, similar to Christianity. However, when it comes down to real practice, then there is a question as to how does the Jewish God relate to non-Jewish existence and non-Jewish life. I know that there's the discussion about the Noahic laws. However, again, you see it's limited to a certain lifestyle. Tying these together, what one really needs is the Greek thought needs to have a sense of time and sequence associated with it, which is adding server thought to perceiver thought. And the Jewish mindset needs to use perceiver thought to look at analogies and similarities between Jewish life, the rituals of Jewish existence, and the experiences and concepts that are outside of this personal ritual. Now, looking at how the mind is constructed, when one ties perceiver and server thought together, one ends up with contributor thought. This is shown in the diagram of mental symmetry. Contributor combines server and perceiver. I did not mention this earlier, but I should expand briefly on how this works. Perceiver works with facts, server works with sequences. Contributor ties those two together. For the contributor person, for contributor thought, every fact is connected with a sequence. That leads to cause and effect, where you have the fact that deals with that contains an inherent sequence. If I do this, then that will happen. The perceiver person talks about truth. The server person works with action. For the contributor person, what matters is truth that is applied. How does this work in real life? Again, looking at this idea of cause and effect. And then in abstract thought, contributor, as we saw, ties together the server sequences of syntax with the perceiver object recognition, leading to words and phrases and their meanings. So that's the abstract and the concrete. Now, if one wants, one can find an example of a contributor approach to incarnation by examining a scientific thought. So we saw there's the Jewish thought, which focuses on the server. There's the Greek thought, which focuses upon the perceiver. Putting them together, one sees a partial example of contributor thought in science. So, again, I mentioned contributor, remember, uses cause and effect, like I just said. So, contributor notice there are the two dots there. So you have two things that are connected, the if and the then, the cause and the effect. That's perceiver thinking, because perceiver builds connections. But notice also that there's this arrow that's leading from one to another. So you have there server sequence, so cause and effect. That's the basic building block for concrete contributor thought. So, when you take that basic building block and you express it in concrete thought, then you have a chain of cause and effects. I do this, it leads to this consequence. Then I do that follows by this action, then that leads to another consequence. So that leads, as one can see in the arrow there, to some final goal. I do step 1, step 2, step 3, some sequence of steps, each of which has a cause and effect. Notice the picture on the right. You have Isaac Newton in the apocryphal story, which probably isn't true, holding the apple, and Newton noticed that the apple followed a certain path in concrete thought. It started in the tree, it fell from the tree, it landed to the ground, and then Newton is now looking at the apple, thinking of the apple. So you have a cause and effect. Fell from the tree, that caused it to fall down to the ground. We're using through gravity, did the action. That's how your cause and effect translates to concrete thought. Now, the same piece of cause and effect, the same connection, can be used to build a theory in abstract thought. Remember that abstract thought wants order within complexity. It is guided by teacher thought. And in this case, you have, looking at the picture on the right, you have the apple falling from the tree. That's one cause and effect. And you have the planets moving around the sun at the top, which is another cause and effect. What abstract thought does is compare one cause and effect with another in order to notice similarities. When there are similarities, perceiver thought will notice that, because perceiver thought notices these patterns. Then you have a general theory, and that was what was key about Newton's theory of gravitation. Because Newton noticed that the same equations can describe the falling of an apple or any object on Earth, and can also describe the movement of a planets around the sun, or moons around planets up in the stars. So you had a single theory applying to all sorts of movement. Again, notice cause and effect is the primary building block for contributor thought. In concrete thought, it's strung together to form actions, form sequences of action, whereas in abstract thought, it's combined to look for common patterns. Before we look at the Christian application, I need to talk a little bit here about philosophy. Remember that technical thought is guided by contributor thought. So when we are dealing with something that involves contributor thought here, we are dealing with the core aspects of technical thought, both technical concrete thought based in cause and effect, technical abstract thought based in precise meanings of words. Therefore, philosophy, because it uses rigorous thought to examine rigorous technical thought, to examine thinking, it has done a lot of very precise thinking about things like cause and effect, and how concrete thought views cause and effect, and how abstract thought views cause and effect. And it uses very precise language and distinctions. It's very interesting to look at these from a cognitive viewpoint, because philosophy says, okay, let's give an example here. Philosophy says there are two types of cause and effect, at least, but these are the primary ones. There's the, I'm sorry, I'm not using the right terms here, but there is a cause and effect where one thing is followed by another. So I kicked the ball, it moved. So you have a sequential cause and effect. That's the concrete. There is also according to philosophy, a logical cause and effect, where one concept, one conclusion follows logically from another conclusion. Again, philosophy has done a lot of thinking comparing these two. Mental symmetry suggests that this thinking is evidence. It helps to understand how the mind is wired, because philosophy, when it analyzes these topics, is studying the mental glitches that emerge when one takes this mental circuit of concrete contributor thought, concrete technical thought, and tries to integrate it with the circuit of abstract technical thought, also controlled by contributor thought. So I just want to mention that because there's a lot of interesting detail that is buried within this simple connection here. Oh, one other thing I need to mention is this whole question of teleology. Science does not like teleology. Teleology says, I do something in order to produce a certain goal. Notice that concrete thought is by its very nature teleological. I go to the fridge and I grab an apple in order to eat it. There is a goal that I have. The theory of evolution, which tries to be a scientific theory, does its very best to avoid teleological thinking. So, for example, to say that the giraffe has a long neck in order to reach the high leaves and eat the high leaves off the tree, that is teleological thinking, because it is evolution has then been it has evolved in order to reach some goal, and that is largely a taboo thinking in scientific circles. One is not supposed to think teleologically. Looking briefly at the cognitive basis behind this restriction. Notice contributor thought works with cause and effect. When this is applied to concrete thought, then it is placed within a concept within a teleological concept. For example, I sow the grain in order to reap the grain so that I can have something to eat. That's a mercy goal. That's what drives concrete thought. So science says, I don't care what you're doing. Okay, using another example, let's look at the apple falling from the ground or falling to the ground. The average person, when he drops something, is very concerned about the goal and the end state. Oh, I'm sorry, I dropped your wonderful vase, it broke. There's a teleological thinking. I did this and I'm sorry about the result. Okay, that's concrete thinking driven by mercy thought. Science says, I don't care. We don't care about about the end result. We focus on the cause and effect. Let's analyze the path that the vase took on its way to its demise, and then compare that with the path that, say, an apple takes when it falls, or that Earth takes when it goes around the moon, the sun. So what's happening is scientific thought is pulling the contributor, cause, and effect out of the context of concrete thought. And by doing that, it is removing it from teleological thinking, because mercy thought, concrete thought, is goal-driven by its very nature. Therefore, by making teleological thinking a taboo, science is actually divorcing itself from the inherent nature of concrete thought. Then what science does is says, okay, we don't care what the end result is. All we will do is we will use abstract thought to compare the falling of the vase, the falling of my brother as he jumps off the cliff, or the falling of the apple, or the falling of the planet as it falls around the sun. And that is an accurate description. It's in free fall. Okay, that's enough on that. I just wanted to mention there's quite a bit of extra detail buried in this whole concept of contributor. Now let's look at what Scripture, what the Bible talks about. Philippians 2:5-11, that is that famous passage, talks about Jesus, who, having the nature of God, did not think it's something to be grasped, but took on the nature of man, emptied himself, and in obedience went to the cross, and therefore God highly exalted him and gave him a name above every other name. Now, let's look at this from a cognitive perspective. First of all, if one looks at the description of Jesus as given in the Gospels, the personality of Jesus corresponds to the personality of the contributor person. So the behavior of Jesus suggests that Jesus had the cognitive style of contributor. Notice then, again, looking at this Philippians 2 passage, what was the plan that Jesus followed? When the sequence, remember this cause and effect, was turned into a concrete set of actions in the real world, what plan was followed? Primarily, it was a plan of rebirth. It was a plan of being born, living, dying, and then being reborn. That's the core doctrine of Christianity, death and resurrection. So you have a sequence there, death followed by resurrection. And then you have the Philippians 2 saying that God, because Jesus emptied himself and died, therefore God has lifted him up and given him a name above every other name. Notice how one is now not focusing upon the life of Jesus, but rather upon Jesus, the essence of Jesus as a plan, and then viewing that from teacher thought as a name. Okay, so Jesus lived the life in concrete thought of death and resurrection. That death and resurrection is then pulled out of the concrete context, looked at as a separate cause and effect, death followed by resurrection. If I die, then I will be reborn. So we have your contributor block of cause and effect, and then God the Father looking at it and says, that is a general theory, rebirth, death and resurrection, looking at the name of Jesus. Jesus, of course, meaning salvation, Yeshua. And so God the Father saying that, from the teacher thought saying, that is a general theory. That theory is will bring order to the complexity of all the other theories. It is the most general theory. It is a name that is above all other names. Difference between a theory and a name is a theory is just it is some system out there, whereas a name is a system that applies to a person. For example, medical doctor is a name. It is a certain structure of organization and understanding. It is a theory. It has order within complexity, but also describes the character and essence of a person, which is the medical doctor. Looking at the big picture of the Trinity. So we have God the Father, which comes from a universal, naturally from a universal theory and teacher thought that applies to personal identity. You have God the Holy Spirit, which is what emerges when when teacher thought comes up with a general theory that leads to a Platonic form of the good in the mercy strategy, a universal concept in mercy thought. And then you have God the Son, who ties together the abstract thinking of teacher universality with the concrete thinking of personal existence. So contributor being the glue that ties together personal identity and mercy experience, because we all live in this teleological, goal-driven, this is where I'm heading today type of existence using actions, with the general understanding in teacher thought. So the biblical concept of Trinity appears to be something that naturally emerges in the mind when one develops it in a whole manner. There are 3 stages to personal salvation. The first stage, again, look, we're using the reference here of the diagram of mental symmetry. The first I suggest is law in the heart. Here one is dealing with the interaction between mercy and perceiver thought. Remember, mental networks naturally develop in mercy thought in the child, and then perceiver thought has a struggles to accurately label and describe and categorize these experiences. So we have going from Habermas' first stage to his second stage. So the challenge in the first stage of salvation is to allow facts in perceiver thought to analyze mental networks in mercy thought. It's personal honesty. This personal honesty, the end result is to build a mental concept of God. So think of each of these facts as a brick and the understanding as a structure that has been built out of a pile of bricks. So the first stage, it leads to a mental concept of God. Relating that to the Gospels, interesting, the word tereo is a Greek word which means keep. It does not mean do, that's poieo. It means guard as with a treasure, and that's what perceiver thought does with truth. It holds on to truth no matter what the feelings are, leading to a concept of God. And as I mentioned before, it hurts to be personally honest. However, if one understands, then the teacher understanding, the teacher pleasure of understanding, counteracts the mercy pain of honesty. This relates to the perceiver side of incarnation, the one that deals with the Greek side, that deals with Platonic forms. And this was something that was new notice in the new covenant, Jeremiah, where it's talking about, I will have a new covenant where will write my law upon your hearts, right? So you going past the Jewish view of actions and sequences and history to the Christian view of law in your heart. That's the first stage. It is an internal stage. This, I suggest, is then followed by a second stage of becoming righteous. Righteousness means acting in a way that is consistent with understanding. So the first stage built a mental concept of God in teacher thought. The second stage now adds actions to that understanding of a concept of God. So I don't just talk about God, that's teacher thought, I act in a way that is consistent with God. Notice how this is different than a path of works. Works uses server action to meet mercy goals. It remains within concrete thought without adding abstract thought to it. Whereas this goes through a detour. It first uses facts in perceiver thought to build a general understanding, a concept of God in teacher thought. And then when one adds action to that, it's not a matter of struggling to reach a goal driven by mercy emotions. It is acting in a way that is consistent with teacher understanding. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The first stage figures out how God's will is done in heaven. The second stage then acts on earth as it is in heaven, going from the teacher to the server. It then becomes, there's an emotional reason. It feels good. It's called righteousness. When a person becomes righteous, he naturally acts in a way that is consistent with the character of God. Why is this the second stage? Because one first must build a concept of God before it becomes possible to act in a way that is consistent with the concept of God. Why is this not works? Because one is being driven not by the mercy goal of struggling to reach some experience, situation, or goal, or follow some person. One is driven by the teacher emotion of order within complexity. It feels good to act in a way that is elegant, that is consistent with understanding. So, allowing the teacher mental network to guide actions. This relates to Kant's categorical imperative. Summarizing this briefly, Kant attempted to define morality in terms of universality, in terms of teacher thought. So he says, for example, why is lying wrong? Because if everyone lied, then it would not work to lie, because nobody would believe anybody, and so it is not possible to universalize lying. Lying only works if most people are honest and a few people lie. So that's an example of viewing morality from a universal teacher viewpoint. That's Kant's categorical imperative. This also relates to the concept of altruism. I mentioned later that viewing God as a big person in mercy thought, as the ultimate head honcho, so to speak, will lead to naturally to an idea that I am nothing, I am a worm compared to the awesomeness of God. That's viewing God from an anthropomorphic viewpoint of he's a very big person, a big mercy mental network, and I am a tiny little mercy mental network. That is the natural way that a childish mind, which starts with mercy mental networks, will view a universal being. It appears that the mind will always take the easiest way out, and that it will only follow a higher route if the lower route is not possible. This provides a cognitive reason for altruism. For example, suppose that I want to, let's look at what Jesus says. He says, if you give your alms before men, then you have no reward from your Father in heaven. You have already received your reward in full. Looking at that cognitively, if one gives money and that act of giving receives approval from the mercy mental network of some person, then the mind will conclude that that action has received its complete reward. The circuit is complete. However, if one gives something, if you give your alms so that no one sees, so that you do it in secret, what happens, that action the mind cannot attach it with any mercy mental network. But if there is a teacher mental network, if you say, no, I am doing this not for man, I am doing this for God, in the mind, this connects the action with the teacher mental network of a general understanding of God. So that mental connecting, the becoming righteous, attaching my server actions internally with my teacher understanding of God, that it's an internal concept of God. That mental connecting will only happen if the actions are not done for a mercy reason, but rather done only for a teacher reason. Related to this, Kant says that the categorical imperative is the highest form of motivation. Now, where I suggest Kant is inadequate is he suggests that's the end of the story. However, I would suggest that that once one has created a link between my actions and my understanding using altruism, it is then possible to add mercy experiences back to the situation because the mental connection has been established now. In other words, it is necessary to act in an altruistic manner in order to become righteous, but once one has acquired the character of being righteous, then it is not necessary to continue acting to continue in altruism, because one will now act guided by a different motivation. And that leads, okay, like I said, this is the server side of incarnation, this action. The action comes after the belief. So that leads to the third stage, which goes beyond becoming righteous to dying to self. The first two stages constructed a new possible identity for personal identity, because it's a new set of facts from the first stage, a new set of actions in the second stage. In the first stage, facts were allowed to apply to personal identity. In the second stage, actions were done that were consistent with general understanding. So now, after the first two stages, you have a perceiver grid of facts, a server grid of actions, leading to this contributor perceiver server connections that is guided by teacher understanding. The third stage is when one personal identity lives within that new grid that was created, that was constructed in the first two grids. And this is when the old mercy mental networks fall apart. This is when one chooses to follow understanding rather than culture. And when mercy mental networks that represent personal identity fall apart, when it will feel like dying to self. It is a painful process. There is no two ways about it. But if one has constructed an alternative, then the falling apart is followed by a coming back together. And so one can live in the new mercy mental networks, mercy mental networks of new identity. So what happens is the mercy goals become transformed. This is going beyond Kant's categorical imperative. Interesting, looking at where Kant was placed historically. He lived between the scientific revolution, which is the analog to the first stage because it built an understanding of the world. But Kant lived before the Industrial Revolution, which used the understanding of science to change the server actions. So he did not realize, he did not live in a society that had experienced the dying to self that science made possible, and leading to a totally new society in which we live now. We'll look at that in the next slide. So this goes beyond Kant's categorical imperative because it adds a transformed mercy goal. It adds the teleological thinking to the righteous thinking. It brings it back, leading to a new identity. And this is the contributor incarnation, the aspect there. In the Bible, it talks about identifying with Christ, identifying with Jesus. So Notice here that all of this process, one is constructing a mental concept of incarnation, because as when one is connecting this perceiver and server, the perceiver facts with the server sequences, this will build a concept of contributor incarnation. When one is using perceiver and server and their combination to integrate teacher understanding with mercy personal identity, this will build contributor thought as an incarnation. So incarnation is a central component of this. And the last stage, one identifies with incarnation. I should mention, and this is not shown here, but it is also possible, let's look, okay. No, I will mention that the next one. Okay. The internal world can now transform the external world. The first three stages produced an internal transformation, a new understanding, a new grid, a new personal identity. Once that has changed inside, that will then automatically, there will be a strong drive to externalize that and to change the world. Moving on. Integrated view of salvation. During this presentation, we have compared the secular thinking, as epitomized in this case by TESOL, but also as illustrated by science and technology, with the subjective path as illustrated by Christianity. So let's put these various pieces together. Look, there's the scientific viewpoint, which focuses upon the teacher thinking, ignores the mercy. The religious looks at the mercy, struggles to understand the teacher. The cognitive, which we are suggesting, tries to tie these two viewpoints together. So, the scientific viewpoint, as I mentioned, the focus is on studying universal natural law. How does everything fit together? What is a teacher mental network of science? As Thomas Kuhn says, a scientist cannot exist without a paradigm. So look for a paradigm. The religious viewpoint, instead of starting with teacher, it starts with mercy, and it says God is a person. God is personal. But the problem is it tends to have an inadequate concept of God, viewing God from a mercy perspective. Cognitively, what one wants to do is one wants to combine the universality with the personal. So you end up with a universal concept of God based in teacher understanding, tied together by a teacher mental network, but this concept applies to personal identity in mercy thought, and it is viewed as a person. So you have a teacher mental network that is viewed as a person and applies to personal identity. So combining the scientific and the religious. For science, the goal is to use rational thought, perceiver facts to build a general teacher theory, a rational teacher mental network. Religious viewpoint, the goal is to change the mercy mental networks of identity, recognizing that one is born in sin, as illustrated by the initial programming of the mind, and to affect that, to transform that. Cognitive attempts to put these two together by saying you start by constructing a rational teacher mental network, but it's one that includes personal identity. That's the first stage of salvation. And then you use that, you don't just construct a theory, you apply that and use that to transform personal identity, as illustrated by the second and third stages of personal salvation. So, scientific viewpoint, it understands the world, it is objective, it transforms the physical world. The religious viewpoint, because it's personal, because it looks at personal change, it changes people's hearts. Hearts being simply the core, what I would interpret as core mercy mental networks of identity. That's the heart, the emotional core of a person's being. Cognitive viewpoint, the goal tries to put these two together by saying the goal is to pursue mental wholeness, as seen in the previous slide, the 3 stages of personal salvation, and that leads to a healthy society. The internal is expressed in the external. Then moving on, if one examines the scientific viewpoint, the history of the scientific viewpoint, one can see 3 stages. There is the scientific revolution, as illustrated by Newton's laws of gravity, Galileo, Kepler, Copernicus, people like that. That led to a new way of thinking. It led to a concept of universal law. That corresponds to the first stage of salvation. That was followed by the Industrial Revolution, in which that understanding was applied in action, where action was guided by understanding, where people started to act in a way that was organized and structured, the factory, the replaceable part. Again, then that was followed by the Consumer Revolution starting somewhere around 1880, 1890, with all these devices that entered the home. During the Industrial Revolution, the transformation occurred at work, in the factory, outside. The Consumer Revolution, then there was the automobile, the telephone, and electricity, electric lights. All those sorts of things entered the home and changed the way the average person lived. So that corresponds to the 3rd stage of personal salvation. This means that rather than looking at science as the enemy of Christianity, one looks at the path of science as a partial illustration and a partial expression of the process of personal transformation. So science, through the scientific revolution, industrial revolution, and consumer revolution, one can see that produced salvation, but that salvation was limited to the external world because science only understands natural law. So it is a limited salvation. It did not save the person. It saved the environment, the external, but not the internal. Looking at these, the stages from a religious viewpoint, you have justification, where the first stage of salvation, where one builds an understanding of God, and we'll look at that in the next stage, next slide, with the prayer of salvation. Then sanctification, where actions become consistent with an understanding of God. That's the 2nd stage of righteousness. And then the 3rd stage of not I but Christ, where personal identity dies and then is reborn in a way that is consistent, that is tied together by contributor incarnation and closely connected with contributor incarnation. That's the religious. The cognitive, again, attempts to put that together and looking at that in more generic terms. There's a first stage of understanding. It can be an understanding of the world. It can be an understanding of linguistics and culture. It can be an understanding of personal identity. But the first stage is understanding. The 2nd stage is application, where one takes that understanding and puts feet on it. Can be any sort of field, whether objective or subjective. And then the application leads to transformation, where one lives in a new way, guided by the understanding and made possible by the application. If one follows just the scientific viewpoint, what can happen is it will sidetrack into scientism. Scientism saying that nothing exists except the external world. So science transforms the external world because it studies the external world. But scientism says that there is only the external world. it says that only the scientific viewpoint exists and that there is no such thing as a religious viewpoint. That's taking partial salvation and claiming that that is total salvation. So that's how science can sidetrack. Religion can sidetrack into mysticism. And here I'd like to describe something which I postponed from the previous slide. We have looked at how contributor thought integrates teacher understanding with personal identity and mercy thought. That is the path of incarnation, where there is an intermediary between God and man. It is also possible cognitively to attempt to jam teacher thought and mercy thought together, to put them directly together, so that I identify directly with God. In the extreme, I will feel I am God, or I am one with God, or I have become unified with God. There are many ways to do this. The way that mysticism will emerge whenever there is a lack of content. Remember that contributor incarnation is constructed from a grid of perceiver facts and server sequences. As one builds that, one is building a concept of incarnation that ties together understanding with personal identity. That's if one does it in a complete and incarnational manner. However, if for any reason, and there are many ways that this can happen, if understanding loses its content, if words become vague, if one goes to just vagueness, what will happen is teacher thought will be free to overgeneralize. Remember, we saw this way back near the beginning, that teacher thought has a natural tendency to overgeneralize, but whereas perceiver thought comes up with counterexamples that limit this overgeneralization. So if perceiver fact, which adds meaning to words, if that becomes sufficiently vague, or perceiver fact does object recognition, if one says, oh, all the world is just an illusion, all these facts about the world, they're not really true, they're just fake facts, then this, or if a person says, I can't fit it together, there is no way to understand it, perceiver thought gives up, can't come up with facts. What happens then, teacher thought is free to generalize an overgeneralized concept of God. This will be a concept of God that lacks content. That sort of God, a contentless God, could also come from negative theology, where one says that I am a worm and I am too much of a sinner to be able to understand anything about make any definitive statements about the universal holy God. That's another way of getting perceiver thought out of the way. So when perceiver thought is got out of the way, however that happens, and teacher thought overgeneralizes, and you get a concept of God based in overgeneralization. All is one. Everything connects together. I am identifying with God. That leads to mysticism. Mysticism is where I have the feeling that I have become united with God. It is an emotional feeling. It is not a connection between God and man based upon content. It is a juxtaposing of teacher emotion with mercy emotion, and one feels that one has become united with the universal. This will work cognitively, and if one is content, if a person is satisfied with a religion that only produces the feeling of having united with God, then mysticism is a good alternative. But if one wants some real salvation, then I suggest that one needs to bridge God and man with content. So, looking at the cognitive viewpoint, tying the scientific and the religious together, cognitive mechanisms, how the mind works, how it is structured, they're universal because everybody has the same mind. They're inescapable because you cannot run away from your own mind. Good luck trying. And it's personal because I live within my own mind. Everyone else lives within his or her own mind. So you have something that's both universal, satisfying the scientific perspective, and it's personal, satisfying the religious viewpoint. It's inescapable, which means it's based upon perceiver facts and server sequences which cannot be altered, which based upon the structure of the mind. It's like saying the wiring of my computer ultimately determines what I can do with that computer. If my computer does not have a DVD drive, then there is no way that my computer will be able to play a DVD because it is not physically capable. It does not matter what software I put on the computer. I will never be able to play a DVD on my computer unless my computer has a DVD drive. Hardware trumps software. That's why it's inescapable. The wiring of the mind, the hardware of the mind, ultimately determines what the software can do. And the general principle, the extent of a person's salvation depends upon the universality of his concept of God. As I mentioned, with mysticism, if one constructs a concept of God that is based in overgeneralization, which lacks specific content, then the extent of salvation that a person will experience is limited to the feeling of being united with God. Similarly, however far I follow the process of constructing a concept of God, that is the extent of personal salvation that I will experience. If I limit my concept of God to the religious realm, to a Christian subculture, then my personal salvation, the ruling of a concept of God, will be limited to my religious subculture and will not affect my secular existence. So that's another reason why one wants to present Christianity as a paradigm, as a general understanding, because this makes it possible to experience greater salvation and does not limit the salvation to a specific religious context. Moving on now finally to the third last? Anyway, the next slide. Prayer of salvation. I've suggested that the first stage of salvation involves personal honesty, where one is applying perceiver facts to mercy identity in order to construct a mental concept of God. Biblically it's called law in the heart, law in your heart. This is very difficult to do, and I suggest that the prayer of salvation makes it possible cognitively to follow this path. So, prayer of salvation, that's what evangelicals say that one prays in order to become a Christian. I would like to look at this prayer from a cognitive perspective and examine what is happening within the mind when one prays that prayer in an honest fashion. I am not saying that it is only cognitive. However, I'm saying that there is a cognitive, and even if only the cognitive exists, then it is still worth saying this prayer, and this prayer is still key to entering the path of personal salvation. So, remember, we have teacher thought, looks for order, wants to see how everything fits together. Mercy mental networks looks for wants personal experiences. It does not care about how everything fits together. We saw that in the limits of embodiment. And so what do these two think of each other? Teacher mental network will look at personal identity and see chaos unincorporated. Like the adult looking at the little child with the runny nose, running around, bumping into things, being obnoxious, just being a general nuisance. That is how teacher thought, which looks for the order, wants the structure, views the mercy mental networks of childish identity. Salvation prayer inserts a contributor plan, remember that's incarnation, between these two. So you have an intermediary that's being placed between these two. Remember, mysticism tries to bring teacher thought and mercy thought directly together by removing content. That leads to the feeling of being united with God. If one attempts to inject content, then this will lead to feelings of inadequacy. God demands perfection because based in ultimate order and structure without exception, but my personal identity is full of exceptions, followed by, as a result of following this shortcut, grabbing after this desire, blocking off that thing. It's just inconsistent, just thinking locally instead of how it all fits together. So salvation prayer inserts the contributor plan between these two. Now let's look at how that happens. First of all, from the mercy viewpoint, how does one connect a contributor plan with a mercy viewpoint? Remember, mercy thought interprets experiences from a personal viewpoint. There's the agency detector, looking at experiences in terms of people, representing people as connections of emotional experiences. So the personal identity in mercy looks at the contributor plan as a person. This is Jesus, salvation. I identify with the plan. I ask Jesus into my heart. So cognitively, this builds a connection between contributor thought, the contributor concept of incarnation, and personal identity and mercy thought. I ask Jesus into my heart. That builds this internal connection. But when you have two sets of mental networks, two sets of identity that are coming together, the question then is which one takes priority over which other one? Which one will impose its structure upon which one? So that's why it's not just identifying with Jesus, it's making Jesus my Lord. In other words, the mercy mental networks of personal identity submit to the mental network, the mercy mental network that represents this contributor plan of incarnation. So I submit my mental networks to the mercy mental network, representing the contributor incarnation, making Jesus my Lord. Now let's turn our perspective to teacher thought. Remember, teacher thought thinks in terms of order, structure, how things fit together. And when you take a person and you interpret it in theoretical terms, you are looking at the name of that person, the label applied to that person. But that label not just as a label, but as a label that summarizes the essence of that person. So the name of praying in Jesus' name, Jesus meaning salvation. One prays in the name of salvation. So teacher thought before saw the chaos of mercy thought. Now, because mercy thought, the identity in mercy thought has submitted itself to the contributor plan of incarnation, what teacher thought then views is not the identity falling up with its fragmentation and inconsistencies, but rather the contributor plan of incarnation. That's why one prays. Praying is a cognitive way of connecting with teacher thought, because when I pray, I am using words, and words form the basic building block for teacher thought. So prayer is a way of triggering, of connecting with teacher thought and triggering various teacher mental networks. So the praying in Jesus' name. And what teacher thought sees is not the fragmentation and childishness of personal identity, but rather the generality of the contributor plan. Remember, therefore God has lifted up his name and given up a name that is above all other names. So you have a generality. So teacher thought sees, hey, what a wonderful plan. This plan is very general. So notice how you have an intermediary. This is all happening cognitively, what we're describing here, where teacher thought, instead of seeing the chaos of childish identity, now sees the generality of the plan of salvation. Well, it's justification. Now, that's theological language. Now let's translate that into school language. And I think this appears to be quite a deep analogy here. So when I enroll in it, okay, what is a school? First of all, it has a curriculum. Curriculum is a set of subjects, a certain path of instruction, a bunch of subject matter that is put together to form a general teacher structure. Teacher thought likes curricula because a curriculum, it has order within complexity. So a school can be viewed from teacher thought as a curriculum and a whole system of education. From the student, though, the curriculum is a set of concrete sequences that one goes through. I take algebra 1, then I take algebra 2, then I take pre-calculus, then I take calculus. And in each I take this subject, I go through chapter 1, then chapter 2, chapter 3. It's a sequence, a personal path for mercy identity to follow. So notice there's this technical thinking, contributor thought, which is rigorously defining the curriculum and also carefully defining the steps that the student follows. However, this curriculum can be viewed either from teacher thought as a universal theory or from mercy thought as a plan of personal salvation. If I pass these classes, if I go through these courses, I will end up in some way saved in the sense of being at a better state than I was beforehand. So, when the child enrolls in the school, then the child is seen as a student of the school. Instead of seeing the child as a little bundle of chaos that is running around and making life miserable, the child, oh, look at the cute uniform, school uniform that little Johnny is wearing. Oh, he's Johnny, what school do you go to? Oh, I've heard of that school. That's a very famous school. Notice how the concept of the person has changed from being a little child who does not know anything to being a student of the school. Similarly, so saying the salvation prayer, I suggest, enrolls identity in the school of salvation, a school of personal transformation, one that goes beyond the partial salvation and partial curriculum of the typical school that we send children to and extends it internally and makes it a more complete school. So I suggest that saying this prayer of salvation will lead to a feeling of having my sins forgiven. Because when teacher thought is displeased internally with mercy thought, this is felt internally. Emotions are emotions. And when teacher thought stops feeling annoyed or angry at mercy thought and starts to feel good about mercy thought, this will lead to a major internal shift in feeling, and a person will feel as if his sins have been forgiven by God. Now, the danger is if one views this as some sort of magical thing, or if one focuses upon this as the goal, then education turns into a diploma mill, where the goal is to get as many students enrolled in the school as possible, and one doesn't worry about what one is teaching those students. That's why I suggest that the prayer of salvation should not be viewed as an end in itself, but rather as a doorway to a school, an opening that one goes through that makes it possible internally to practice personal honesty. So what does, relating this to this whole concept of unconditional acceptance, there are two views, the extreme views. One is the view of, I don't know whether I am saved. It's the uncertainty. I must always have to do certain works to remain in God's good books. This is like the student feeling that he has to get an A in order to be satisfied, in order for the school to be happy with him, in order for the powers that be to be pleased with him. That's the one viewpoint. The other viewpoint is to say, once you've said the prayer of salvation, then everything is fine, doesn't matter what you do. That leads to cheap grace. I suggest an intermediate view where peace with God depends upon remaining a student. In other words, as long as one stays in the school, it doesn't matter whether one is getting an A or a C or a D, or even if one has to repeat the occasional class. As long as one sticks in the school, does not drop out of the school, and remains a legitimate student, then there is peace with God. So it is a conditional acceptance, but it is not conditional upon performance. It is conditional upon being submitted to a certain plan. Again, notice that one is looking not at the status of the student, but rather the status of the curriculum of Jesus Christ, of the Incarnation as a whole. So one has the righteousness of Jesus Christ. So as long as one remains within the plan of Incarnation, a member of the enrolled in the school of salvation, then there is peace with God. Now, we have looked at it cognitively, and that because one can analyze it cognitively, that makes it discussable. It's not just, it's a magical prayer of salvation. However, where does the supernatural come in? Let me suggest one way where it enters. Who starts a school? How does a school begin? Who originally comes up with the curriculum? The person who initially sets up a school has to learn and develop the curriculum without the benefit of having a school. And so that leads us to pose the following question. Who initially set up this Christian system of the prayer of salvation, the Trinitarian God, all these Christian concepts? Where did they come from? If one compares the New Testament and the Bible in general with the society of around the contemporary society, with the Roman world, one finds that the Christian doctrine makes a lot of sense, seems to make total sense from a cognitive perspective. But if one looks at the thinking of the people around there, they do not make sense. They are operating at a much lower level. And so it's as if a modern physics textbook was somehow dumped on first century society. And that poses a question. Where did it come from? And that leads one to posing the hypothesis that something or someone from outside natural existence imposed or revealed some content. So that's, if one, just simply looking at it from a cognitive viewpoint, one comes to the conclusion that something had to start it, and it could not start itself. How does that relate to normal thought? You have contributor thought. When contributor thought is in control, that's technical thought. School is very much technical. It's a limited realm. It's not all of existence. But normal thought unfolds this technical plan of salvation. So you find scripturally, Christ is the head of the church, in control, starting the plan, providing the structure for the plan, but the church is the body that unfolds the plan using analogy and using patterns and metaphor and similarity to extend this to other realms of existence. So that's related to what I suggested later of normal thought tying together these mental networks and the technical thought. Multiple worlds. I've suggested that scientism is inadequate. Scientism being the belief that nothing exists except physical reality, and that everything must be explained in terms of physical reality. If one explains theology using only cognitive mechanisms, then really one is following scientism, because one's ignoring the supernatural. It's simply a psychological system. Now, I suggest that Christianity can be described as a cognitive system. However, I also would like to end this by looking at the relationship between the cognitive and the natural and the supernatural. In other words, how does this tie in with this whole thing of the angelic realm, of the supernatural realm, of the spiritual realm? So, first we have the human world. We know this one exists. We live in it. How does one interact? How does the mind interact with the human world? Through concrete thought. What makes concrete thought concrete? The fact that it interacts with the real world. So, mercy thought works with experiences. Mercy thought is programmed by emotional experiences from the external world. Server thought performs action. Server thought can use the physical body to move through the world and to manipulate elements of the real world. So we know that there's a human world. We know that external world is compatible with concrete thought in the mind. Now let's turn our attention. Okay, this is known from observation. Now let's turn our attention to abstract thought. Physicists like to play the game of what if. What would happen if one would interpret a certain set of rules of physics from a different perspective? So let's play what if. What would happen if, instead of concrete thought being concrete, abstract thought was concrete? In other words, what would happen if the human mind, the same human mind with the same structure, lived in an environment and inhabited a physical container that was compatible with abstract thought rather than concrete thought? Instead of living in a world of mercy experiences, as we do as humans, you would have beings lived in a realm of teacher thought with names and energy and waves and sequences. And instead of using server thought to do sequences to act in the world, perceiver thought would have the power to transform the external environment. If one examines the implications of this, one comes up with conclusions that are consistent with descriptions of angels. Angels have missions. They deliver messages. The word angel means messenger. Angels talk about their names. So angels have power. And one can explore this further. But in general, if one hypothesizes an external realm that is compatible with abstract thought rather than concrete thought, one comes up with something that is consistent with the descriptions of angels. Moving further, we know that mental networks drive the mind. Mercy mental networks of personal identity, teacher mental networks of understanding of a concept of God. So what would happen if there is an external environment that resonates with mental networks? That appears to lead to be consistent with the description of the spiritual realm. The glue for the spiritual realm, according to a lot of people, is love. Love holding everything together. Love being the emotion, and the emotion as a glue, and mental networks based in emotion. Interesting, when one looks at biblical description of spirits, they supercharge human abilities. So You have it's as if the spirits are living in the mental networks, human networks, mental networks, and are resonating with these mental networks and are giving additional power to these mental networks. Again, this is a hypothesis, but it is a way of saying, how can the human mind be compatible with the spiritual realm? Evil spirits, they appear to lack content, and they acquire their content from the physical people, from mental content, and they want to possess bodies. Compare that with angels in the body. In Scripture, there is no description in the Bible of angels, either in the Old or New Testament, wanting to possess bodies or lacking content. All the angels, they have missions, they have content, they have messages to deliver. They don't possess. The spirits, both in the Old and New Testament, interesting, it's a different description. And there's an interesting passage in Acts 23. Paul is in front of the Sanhedrin. Yeah, he's in, and they respond. I think it's the Pharisees say, maybe a spirit or an angel spoke to him, because the Pharisees believe in spirits and angels. Just interesting that that passage talks about those two as distinct beings. So, looking at this in the big picture, what this means is that the real question is not, is there a different world? Is there an angelic world? Is there a spiritual world? But I suggest the real question is my mind capable of interacting with the angelic world or interacting with the spiritual world? Because remember that the mental networks, one acquires them from living in the physical body, living in the physical world. These mental networks will assume the existence of a human world. Therefore, when the typical human experiences any hint of something either angelic or spiritual, it disrupts, it is inconsistent with these core mental networks and causes them to be threatened. That's why it seems the first word that most angels say in the Bible is, fear not. Why? Because interaction, if such a world really exists, such an interaction would be very threatening to core mental networks. So, the human mind, according to this hypothesis, is potentially compatible with the human world, the angelic world, and the spiritual world. However, in order to actualize that potentiality, one has to go beyond the mental networks that were acquired from living in a human world in order to become whole and to acquire and have an integrated mind that is capable of combining abstract thought with concrete thought and mental networks. If all of those work in an integrated fashion, then mental symmetry suggests that it would be possible for a human person, the human mind, to interact with an angelic world and a spiritual world and remain sane. So again, not suggesting that these other realms do not exist, but rather that whether they exist or not, the critical factor, what one needs to emphasize on is cognitive wholeness, internal wholeness. Again, it becomes discussable. Finally, summing up, if one looks at the big picture of society, I suggest that we are converging to spirituality without theology, to mercy experiences without teacher understanding. Looking at the secular realm, folk religion is now a legitimate topic of research in secular research. So you have cognitive science of religion studying folk religion. That's the experiential side, the mercy side. There's a group, a religious consortium at UBC that is doing similar research. So folk religion, the mercy side of religion, is now a legitimate topic of study. Looking now at the Christian field, Christians are looking for experience, religious experience. They're looking for sacrament. How can I bring my Christian faith, how can I feel it and express it at a concrete level in terms of actions and real experiences? So going away from the theology to the experience, to the spiritual. The average person on the street, one finds this more and more, they don't want religion, but they do want spirituality. They have lived in an objective, inhuman, consumer society, one that has transformed the world but has not transformed people. They want more, they're looking for more, but they don't want the fundamentalism, the judgmentalism of revealed truth type religion. If one wants to go beyond that to personal transformation, theology is needed. Again, we have said many times the reason for that, reiterating, in order to, when mental networks are strong enough, then you have to play one mental network against another in order to transform the core mental networks, mercy mental networks of personal identity. One has to build an alternative teacher mental network of general understanding, and that is done through theology. So Christianity says the person is saved through belief, a belief in God, through building that understanding. Similarly, when one sends children to school, one gives them propositional content. This is truth, here are facts, learn these facts. And as I mentioned, if one wants to transform childish mercy mental networks, one needs a teacher mental network. A cognitive approach makes theology discussable. Way back, I said that a scientist needs a general theory, needs a paradigm. If the Christian or the religious person comes to the scientist and says, and the scientist asks, how does this work? And the Christian says, God does it. That's an untheory. You can't do anything with it. You can't understand it. There's nothing there for teacher thought. However, a cognitive approach turns it into a theory that can be analyzed. It's based in cognitive mechanisms. It doesn't have to quote from holy books. This doesn't mean that one throws away the holy book, but instead one finds that instead of going from revealed truth and a proclaimed concept of God, one goes to universal truth. This book is describing something that is universally true, and a constructed concept of God. Instead of just saying that God is omnipresent, one builds a concept of God that is omnipresent, that does apply to all concepts. Okay. So, and that's building a concept of God that brings in creates a perceiver and server grid of content. It uses incarnation to tie everything together. Goes beyond simply saying words. Looking now at TESOL, it's forced to deal with mercy mental networks of culture and identity. It is forced to deal with teacher mental networks of a language. So Christianity, theology, it looks at the interaction between theology and personal identity. TESOL, by its very nature, has to deal with a similar conflict, a similar juxtaposition between theory and identity. So it's dealing with similar problems cognitively.